In this video, we are going to create an authentication system in Blazor WebAssembly. The idea here is to allow our users to create accounts, log in, log out, and have those users in a database. With this, we will be able to hide some functionality of our app behind an authorization system, in which only authorized users will be able to use certain parts of our application. So let's do this. The first step is to come here to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to the client project, and we're going to go to the startup class, and we will add authorization core. For that, we say services add authorization core. The second step is to import the authorization namespace. First, you need to make sure that it is on your client project file. So let's go to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to your client project, edit project file, and you need to make sure that you have this Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Component.Authorization here. After that, let's go to the Solution Explorer again, and now to the imports file, and you need to make sure that you are using the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components Authorization package. That way, you are bringing in all the functionality you need in order to use authorization on your Blazor application. Now let's go to the AppRazor file, which is where we have our router. Here, we're going to change this route view so that it is AuthorizeRouteView. This AuthorizeRouteView will make it possible for us to display certain content based on the user authentication status, and it will provide us a cascading parameter with which we will be able to determine if a user is authenticated through C# code. A cascading parameter is a parameter that you can define on a component in such a way that every inner component, every child component, will have access to that parameter. We actually have to define a cascading parameter right here, which is going to be the cascading authentication state. This way, even if the route is not found, we're going to have access to the user authentication information. This way I can say something like, page not found, oh sorry Felipe, the page has not been found. This component, AuthorizeRouteView, already provides a cascading authentication state, so that's why we don't have to put that component here. Another thing we need is an authentication provider. An authentication provider is a class that tells Blazor whether the user is authorized or not. So let's create that class. For that, we're going to go to the Solution Explorer. We're going to create a new folder. We will call it Auth. And just for experimentation, we're going to start with a dummy authentication provider. After that, we're going to create a real authentication provider, and we'll determine if the user is authenticated or not. But for now, let's keep it simple, and let's create a dummy authentication provider. For that, we're going to create a class. We're going to call it dummy auth state provider, and we need to inherit from authentication state provider. Let's bring this namespace, and we have to implement the abstract class, which tells us to implement this method. And here, I can basically identify the user. I can say, this user's name is Felipe, or this user's name is John, or whatever. For now, we will keep it simple, and we will just return an empty identity. So we're going to say var identity new claims identity. We're going to bring this namespace, and now we will say return await task from result. These have to be asynchronous. We have to return a task, as you can see here, because this method is expected to be asynchronous. And we're going to say new authentication state, new claims principal, and we will pass this identity. And we have to make this method async so that this await operator works. And that's it for now. Now, what can we do with this? Well, let's say that we want to dynamically display some content depending on the authentication state of the user. So for example, if the user is not authenticated, then we want to display something for him, or if the user is authenticated, then we want to display another message. So let's do that. Let's go to our counter component. Let's go to the Solution Explorer, Pages, Counter Component, and we're going to introduce you to the AuthorizeedView component. The AuthorizeedView component allows you to define what the user is going to see depending on his authentication state. For that, you can define three parameters here, which are authorized, which means what the user is going to see if he is authorized to see this content, not authorized, which is what the user is going to see if he is not authorized, and authorizing, which means what we're going to display to the user if the authentication process has not yet finished. Like for example, if you are consulting your web API, that could take a few seconds. So what you are going to show your user during those few seconds. So let's say that we want to display this button only if the user is authorized. If the user is not authorized, then we want to display a message, something like, you are not authorized to do this. And here we're just going to say authorizing. Now finally, before testing our application, we have to serve our dummy authentication provider through the dependency injection system. So for that, let's go back to our startup class, and let's say here, services, add a scope, and let's say, for this class that we have here, we want to serve an instance of this class. And let's bring the corresponding namespaces. And that's it. We're ready to test our application. So let's press Ctrl F5. And here we are in our project. Let's go to counter. And as you can see, we have the message, you are not authorized to do this. But we were not able to see the authorizing message. That's because we're just returning an empty authorization state. And we're doing this immediately. So we have no time to see the authorizing message. So what we can do is to use a task delay. So for that, let's go back to our dummy authentication state provider. And we're going to say here, await task.delay. And we're going to say 3 seconds. And we're going to compile our application. And this should give us enough time to see the authorizing message. Now let's go back to Google Chrome. So if we refresh this page, we are going to get an authorizing here, but if you noticed, we didn't get the counter component right away. There was an authorizing message, but that one came from a different part of our application. That actually came from the Blazor file. You see, if we go back to the Blazor file, and because we have this AuthorizeRouteView, he's automatically inserting a layout view, which says basically that if you are in a authorizing state, then you are going to be displayed that authorizing message. Well, a natural follow-up question will be, what can you do with it? Can you customize that message? If you come here, you're going to see that we have authorizing and not authorized parameters, and they are render fragments, which means that through them we can pass code, and so we can do the following. We can say this, we can expand this, and now here I can say authorizing, and now I can personalize the message that appears on the screen. So for example, I'm just going to say customize authorizing, and now let's compile the application, and let's go back to Google Chrome, let's refresh the page, and as you can see we have customize authorizing. Now let's do another test. Let's go to the dummy authentication provider, and let's actually say that our user is authenticated. For that, we're going to remove the delay, and in new claims identity, we're going to say authentication type. With the authentication type, it is enough information to indicate that the user is authenticated. We can just say anything we want here, something like test. And with that, we are authenticated. Let's compile our application to see this. Let's go back to Google Chrome. Let's refresh this page. And as you can see, we have the button here, which means that we are authorized to see this button. And we are authorized because the authentication provider says so. And this is important to understand. The authentication provider is the source of truth with respect to the authentication state of the user. Something else we can do is to define claims. A claim is a piece of information about the user in which we can trust. And we can trust in that information because it was issued by an entity in which we trust. In our case, we will have claims that will come from our web API. But here what we're going to say is that we're just going to hardcode one claim. So we're going to say a new list of claims. And I'm going to initialize here a claim. And I'm going to say new claim, where the claim types is going to be name. And I am going to say that its name is Felipe. And with that, we can actually display the name of the user as Felipe, as we will see in just a bit. As we have seen, we can use the AuthorizeedView component to determine what the user is going to see on the UI if he is authorized or not. But sometimes we will want to be able to determine through C# code whether the user is authenticated or not, so that we can execute custom logic. How can we do that? Remember that we talked about a cascading parameter that we are going to be able to use throughout our application. And through that cascading parameter, we are going to retrieve the authentication state of the user. So let's do that. Let's go back to the counter component and let's go to the code section, and we're going to define a new parameter, but this is going to be not a normal parameter as we are used to see, but this is going to be a cascading parameter. A cascading parameter does not have to be public. In fact, you probably want it to be private. So let's say task authentication state, get and set. And now let's say that in the increment count method, we want to add by this increment by amount if the user is authenticated, otherwise we want to subtract. So first things first, we need to await the authentication state because this is a task. So let's say auth state, it is going to be equal to await authentication state, which is this property that we have here. And of course we have to make this method async and it will return task. And now let's say user equal to auth state user, and from this user we can say things like user.identity.isAuthenticated, and here I can put this line of code here, and we can say else if the user is not authenticated, then current count minus increment by. Now we have to get rid of this AuthorizeView because we want to do a test by code, and we need to be able to always press this button. And let's put this in a div just so it's displayed in a different line than this input that we have here. And now let's run our application. We're going to do the first test as an authenticated user. So let's go back to Google Chrome, and we're going to see that if I click here, this is increasing by 1 every time I click on the button. Now let's go back to Visual Studio, and before removing my authentication, I want to make a test here, which is that I want to say console write line and display my username. So let's say user identity name, and let's see that we're actually going to be able to retrieve the value from the claim that we put in the dummy auth state provider class. Let's go back to Google Chrome, let's refresh the page, let's press F12, and here in the console you are going to see Felipe, which is exactly what the claim says. Now let's close this, and let's see that if I remove the authentication type, then that is enough for Blazor to say that I am not authenticated. It doesn't matter how many claims I have. If I don't have a authentication type, then for Blazor, I am not authenticated. Let's see that. Let's go back to Google Chrome. Let's refresh the page. And now you're going to see that by pressing this button, we are actually doing a subtraction. Now let's go back to Visual Studio and let's keep testing this. Now we saw that we have the AuthorizeView component in which we can say display this content if the user is authorized, or display this other content if the user is not authorized. And that is okay, but what happens if we have a component that we don't want to display at all for not authenticated users? Well, for that we can use the authorized attribute at a component level. So let's go here at the top of the component, and we're going to say attribute, and let's say authorize. And for that we need to use using Microsoft ASP.NET Core authorization. If this is something that you are going to use throughout your application, you know that you can put this in the imports file so that you don't have to worry about it again. So let's go to our imports file and let's put this here, and this problem will disappear. And now we are not authenticated according to our dummy authentication provider, so let's see what happens if I try to go back to our counter component. Let's go to Google Chrome, let's refresh the page, and as you can see, I am not authorized. Of course, again, just like authorizing, this is a message that you can customize. For that, you can go back to the AppRazor file, and here you can pass another parameter, which is going to be not authorized, and you can say something like customize not authorized. Of course, this doesn't have to be just text. You can use a component here and display whatever you want. Now let's go back here and let's test this, and you can see that we have our customized not authorized message. And of course, if we go back to the dummy Authentication State Provider and we provide an authentication type, let's go by test again and we compile the application. Then we can go back here, we can refresh the page, and we have our component back up again. Now let's work on our real authentication system. With this, we will allow users to register in our application and log in and log out. And of course, we will be able to use everything we have learned so far, like using the AuthorizeView and using the app Blazor to customize the user experience when he is authorizing or when he is not authorized. For that, let's go back to Visual Studio, let's go to the Solution Explorer, and let's go to our server project. And if you remember from a previous video, we have the application DB context here, which is our data context class. Here what we have to do is to inherit from identity DB context. We will press Ctrl period and we're going to say install package Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core, and we will find and install the latest version. We will press enter. That may take a few seconds, and that is done. What this does is that it provides us with a set of tables that we can use for our authentication system. The next step is to come down here to the Package Manager console. If you don't have it here, you can always go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager console, and now we can add a migration, and I'll call it identity. And as we can see, we have a few methods here that are creating table like ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET users, in which you will be able to store the users of your application. Now let's apply the migration. Let's go to the Package Manager console and say update database, and that's it. We have the tables in our database. Now we must go to the startup class of the server project in order to configure identity with Entity Framework and to configure the two pieces of middleware that we need. So for that, let's go to the Solution Explorer, let's go to the server project, and let's go to the startup class, and let's come down here, and here we're going to say services at identity user, and let's bring the corresponding namespace, identity role at Entity Framework stores, and let's put here the application DB context and add default token providers. The authentication scheme that we are going to use is the better scheme, and we will use JSON Web Tokens. For that, we can paste the following code. Here, we're configuring our authentication system. Let's bring this namespace, and for that, we will have to install this package, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT Better, find and install latest version, and we need to bring this namespace, and this one too. With this, we are doing a basic validation configuration, and as you can see here, we need to define a key, which is going to be a secret key that it is going to be used to encrypt the JWT information. This allows us to know whether the authentication token is valid. So for that, as we can see, we have to go to some configuration provider, and we have to go to JWT and put a key in the key property. So for that, we can go to Solution Explorer, to the app settings JSON that we created previously, and I am going to say here JWT, and I'm going to say key, and I will put here a random key. It is usually not good practice to put this kind of keys here. These keys here because they can end up in a version control system. What we usually do is to put them in some sort of environment variable in the server. But for this tutorial, this will suffice. And by the way, this key needs to be long enough. You can just come here and put 123 because the application is going to blow up. You need a long enough key so that the encryption works correctly. So this will take care of this that we have here, and now let's go down here and we need to implement some middleware. After routing, let's say use authentication, and after we have the user authenticated, we can use authorization to determine if it's allowed to consume a resource. Now we have to create a controller that will allow our user to create and log in into our application. For that, let's go to the Solution Explorer, let's go to the Controllers folder, let's add a new class, and I'll just call it Accounts Controller, and let's paste this code here. And let's bring all the namespace that we need. Let's bring this one, Claims. We're going to create these two models later, but for now, let's go up here. Let's bring this one, Identity User, and iConfiguration. As we said, this controller will allow our users to create an account and log in into our application. We have the create user action that will allow our user to create an account. As you can see, what we are doing here is that we are instantiating a new identity user, and then we are using that user manager that we are injecting with dependency injection here, user manager of identity user, and through that we can create a new user, passing it the user identity and the password. And if the result succeeds, then we build a token. We will talk about the token in a minute, but beside that action, we have the login action, which the user can use to log in. Here we have that we are using the sign-in manager, we're saying password sign-in async, and passing an email and password, and if it's persistent, and logout and failure parameters. And if it succeeds, then again we build the token. So what is the token? Well, in JWT or JSON Web Tokens, we pass the authenticated user a token, which is going to be a string that basically identifies that user. That string contains a set of claims. As we said before, a claim is some information in which we can trust about the user. So in a claim, we can put the user's name, his email address, and things like that. Though, we should not put sensitive information about the user, like its password. So let's go to this build token, and the first thing that we're going to see is that we are initializing a set of claims. In a claim, I can put whatever I want, whether it is the user's email, its name, or as we can see here, my value and whatever I want. These are just key value pair information. This is the key, and this is the value. We can use this to create a unique identifier for the token. This can allow us to unauthorize a specific token through this ID that we are generating here. Now let's bring this namespace too, and this one. And after that, as we can see, we are generating a new symmetric key using our JWT key that we put in the app settings file. We have this new sign-in credentials, and then we're defining an expiration time. You can put whatever you want here. For example, you want this token to expire after 1 hour, or after 1 day, or after 1 year. It all depends on the nature of your application. Then we are generating a new JWT token with all the information that we have above. And finally, we are using this custom model to pass to the user the token and the expiration of said token. Now let's create these two classes, user token. For that, we're going to go to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to the share project, and we can create it here in our models folder. Let's say user token, and here we will have these two properties. And let's create the other model, which is going to be called user info, and this one is going to have an email property and a password property. And let's bring this namespace. And now let's go back to our accounts controller, and let's bring this namespace. And as we can see, there are no more errors in this class. And with this, we have finished configuring our authentication system on the server side. Now we can put it to test. For example, let's go to the Solution Explorer, and let's go to Controllers, and let's go to the People controller. And let's say, just for a moment, that we don't want any non-authorized user to be able to retrieve the people information. For that, we can use a authorize here, and let's bring the namespace, and we have to say what authentication scheme we are going to use. So for that, we are going to say JWT better defaults. Let's bring this namespace, and let's say authentication scheme, which is the same authentication scheme that we use here. So now we can test our application. Now let's compile our application and see what happens if the user goes to the people component. Let's go back to Google Chrome, let's refresh the page, and let's go to people, and we can see that we have this loading message here, but nothing happens. If you press F12, you can see that we got an error, and the error says that the server responded with a status of photo1 unauthorized. It means that we are not authorized to access the resource that we were trying to reach. And it doesn't matter whatever we put on our dummy authentication provider. If we go to the dummy authentication provider, you can see that we are claiming that we are Felipe and that we have this authentication type. And this doesn't matter because we don't have a valid token to communicate with our web API. So what can we do? Well, we are going to build a new authentication state provider that it is going to manage JSON Web Tokens. So let's get to work. The first thing we're going to do is to close all these because we have too many things open. Now let's go to the Solution Explorer and let's give the user a way to actually log in or log out. For that we're going to go to our client project, to the share folder, and we're going to create a new component. And we will call it auth links, and we will use here an authorized view, and we will say if the user is authorized, or in our case authenticated, then we're going to say hello, context, user, identity, name. We're going to greet the user with his name, and we're going to present him a logout link so that he can log out. And we will say here logout. And if the user is not authorized, which means in this case that he is not authenticated, then we will give him two links, one for register, and another one for login. And we're going to put this component in our main layout. So let's go to the main layout, and here let's say auth links, and we can compile our application to test this. Let's go back to Google Chrome, let's refresh the page, and you can see that we have a hello Felipe because the authorized view is seeing that we are supposedly authenticated from the dummy authentication state provider, though of course because we don't have a valid token, we cannot communicate with our authorized action in the web API. Now let's close this, and the next thing we are going to do is to create a real authentication state provider. So for that, let's go back to Visual Studio, let's go to the Solution Explorer, let's go to Auth, and let's create a new class. We'll call it JWT Authentication Provider. And of course, we will inherit from Authentication State Provider. Let's bring the namespace, and let's implement the abstract class. Let's delete this. And now what we're going to do here is that we are going to check if the user already has a token to be used to communicate with the web API. If the user doesn't have a token, then we can just say that he is not authenticated. But if the user has a token, then we need to try to use that token, parse the claims from it, and use it throughout our application. But where are we going to store the token? For that we can use LocalStorage, which allows us to save information into the user's browser. And for that we're going to use JavaScript, so we must go back to our helpers folder, to our IIS runtime extensions class, and we're going to go down here, and we're going to create 3 helper methods to work with local storage. And we can paste this here, and as you can see we have 3 methods, one for storing information into local storage, and we do that by using a key and whatever content that we want to store. Then we have another method to retrieve whatever information we have saved on this key, and finally we can remove an item from local storage. Now let's go back to our JWT authentication provider, and let's use dependency injection. In order to use the IIS runtime, let's bring the corresponding namespace. Let's say JS, and let's create it as a field. And now we can say var token await JS, and we need this namespace. Let's get this namespace from here, and let's paste it here. And now we can say get from local storage, and we're going to initialize a key here. We're going to say token key. We need to make sure to always use this token, so that's why I'm creating it as a read-only variable. And now we have to make this method async, and with this we're retrieving the token from local storage, and if there is no token, then that means that the user is not authenticated. And for that we're just going to return an anonymous authentication state. For that, we can use a variable here, authentication state anonymous, and we're going to say new authentication state, new authentication state. We're putting it here because we're going to use it from several places, new claims identity. And then from here we can say return anonymous. And with this we're saying that if the user does not have a token, then he is an anonymous user. Now, in the case that the user has a token, then we need to parse it in order to retrieve from it all the claims. For that, we can use the following code. This is some code that it was not created by me, but it was created by one of the creators of Blazor. We expect to have this functionality native in Blazor so that you don't have to be using this code. It will be better if all of this came from the framework. But for now, we have to use this. And of course, all this code will be on the GitHub repository of this project, and you can find the link in the description of this video. Now let's go up and use this. We can create a helper method here that will return a new authentication state. We will call it build authentication state, and it will receive a token. And we need to use the HTTP client service here. And the reason for that is that it is through the HTTP client that we're going to set the token to always be sent to the server when we communicate with it. So let's say HTTP client here, and this works because the HTTP client, it is a singleton, and whatever we do with it here is going to be replicated throughout our application. So let's create and initialize as a field, and now let's go back here and let's say HTTP client default request header authorization. So we're saying that every time we communicate with the web API, we want to add a new header, and in that header we're going to be using better space and the token. Authentication header value, and we will bring the namespace. The scheme, as we said before, it is the better scheme, and we're just going to pass the token. The server will be able to read this token and determine if it is valid or not. And then let's say, because we need to build a new authentication state, which is the one that says to Blazor that we are actually authenticated and that we have this set of claims. For that, we're going to say authentication state, new claims principal, new claims identity, and we're going to say parse claims from JWT, and we're going to pass the token. And let's come here in the claims identity and let's put a authentication type. We can just say JWT, and let's put a semicolon here, and that's it. Now from here we can use this helper method and we can say return build authentication state, and we can pass the token. And that's it for this method. This method gets executed immediately after the user enters the application. Now we need to handle also methods like login and logout. For that, let's go down here and let's say public async task login. What do we need to log in the user? Well, we need a token, we need a valid token, and so we're going to store that token in LocalStorage. We're going to use our token key, and we will pass the token var authentication state, and we're going to build the authentication state with our method, and then we're going to say notify authentication state change. This allows the application to react to the fact that the user has a new authentication state, in this case that he is logged in. And let's say task from result, and let's pass it our authentication state, which is this one. Now let's handle the logout functionality. Let's say public async task logout, and for this one let's go back here and let's copy this. We need to remove this. We need to remove the header that has the token. We need to say await JS remove item. We're going to remove the token from LocalStorage, and again we are going to notify authentication state change task from result, and we're going to say that the new authentication state of the user is that he is an anonymous user. And now we need a way to consume this login and logout method from our application. For that, I like to do the following. I like to come here and create a new interface. We will call it iLoginService, and we can create that immediately. The idea is that we are going to use login and logout through that interface. So let's go to auth. Let's create a new item, interface, iLoginService, and we will make it public. And we will just say task login, string token, and task logout. And that's it. Now let's create a few components that will help the user to log in, log out, and register an account. Let's start with the register component. For that, let's go to the Solution Explorer. In Pages, we are going to create a new folder, and we will call it auth. And let's create the first component, new item, ASP.NET Core, Razor component, register. This is going to be a routable component or a page component, and it will be under register route. We are going to use edit form, and of course we are going to use our user info model that we created a few minutes ago that has an email and password properties. Now let's go to register, and let's say user info, new user info, and we're going to use user info as our model user info on valid submit, create user. We're going to be using data annotations validator. Let's create a div, form group, label email, div input text. We need an input for the email, class form control, bind value, and of course we're going to say user info email. And we need a validation message component here, which is going to work for user info email. And now we need to do the same for the password, but as we are going to see, if we do this and we say password here, you are going to see that we don't actually have a input password component. So we need to create one, which is actually pretty straightforward. Let's go to our Solution Explorer. Let's go to the share folder and let's create a new component. Of course, probably in the future, Blazor is going to provide a default input password component, but for now, we need to create our own. So let's say input password, and let's do the following. We need to inherit from input base string, and what this component is going to be is just an input type password, which is going to bind to the current value. This comes from this base class here. We're going to pass it an ID, and for class we're going to say CS class. Let's remove this, and here we're going to say parameter public string ID just in case we need it, and we need to implement protected override bool try parse value. Let's put this in a way that you can see it. Result equal value. There's really not much try parse logic to do here, so validation error message, it is going to be null, and we will just return true. And with that, we can use this component in our register component, as you can see here. And now let's say here password, and of course password here also. Now we need a button right here. We can say button type submit register, and let's give it some style, button primary. And now let's go down here and let's create this method, create user. This is going to be an async method, so we'll return task, create user, and we need to inject three things. We need to inject first the HTTP client in order to communicate with the web API, because we want to make a post request to our accounts controller. So let's say HTTP here. Now let's also inject our iLoginService, login service, and we need its namespace. So let's go here and let's take this and let's put it here. And finally, we need to get a hold of the navigation manager, because after registering, we want to redirect the user. So let's say navigation manager, and now let's go down here. And first, we need to make a request to our accounts controller. We're going to say post JSON async, just to keep it simple, user token, API, /accounts/create. And we're going to pass it the user info. Of course, after experimenting a little bit with Blazor, I don't like to use too much these JSON helpers, because if, for example, you return an error from the web API, you get an exception. And you get an exception because this helper tries to deserialize the error into a user token object, which is obviously impossible, and hence you get the exception. But for now, we will keep it simple and we will just use the post.json-async method because of its convenience. Now let's say await login service login result.token, because the user token can hold a token, and we're going to say navigation manager navigate to, and we will just navigate to the root of our application. Now we need to register in our dependency injection system our new JWT authentication provider and our iLogin service. For that, let's go to here, to the startup class of our client project, and let's say the following. First, we need to do something special because we are using this JWT authentication provider for two things. We're using it for our authentication state provider and we're using it for our iLogin service. So we need to use the same instance of the JWT authentication provider and inject that instance when we need an authentication provider and iLogin service. For that, we can do the following. We can say services add scoped JWT authentication provider. Now with this, we can get hold of an instance of the JWT authentication provider, and that instance is the one that we're going to use for this. So we will say JWT authentication state provider, but we need to say provider get required service, and then here we are going to retrieve this JWT authentication provider instance that we declared here. And let's put this in another line so it fits in the entire screen. And now let's do the same for the iLogin service. Let's say iLogin service JWT authentication state provider, and let's say provider get required service JWT authentication provider, and that's it. Now we're ready to make a test. Let's run our application by pressing Ctrl F5, and let's test the register functionality of our application. Let's see if we can actually register. Let's go to here, and we can see we have our form. I am just going to say Felipe@hotmail.com, which is not my email address. And by default on identity, it needs to have uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and non-alphanumeric characters. I always use this one. So let's paste this here. Let's click on register. And as you can see, we have hello Felipe@hotmail.com here. This is something that is hard-coded, so do not be confused by it. But as you can see, we have registered ourselves in our application. Let's go to Visual Studio to verify this. Let's go to the SQL Server Object Explorer. You need to go to your database, to the database that you are using for your application. In my case, I am using LocalDB. Let's go to databases. Let's go here. Let's go to tables. Let's go to ASP.NET users, view data, and as you can see, we have here Felipe@hotmail.com. So that's good. Now we need to implement the login component and the logout component. Let's start with the login component. The login component is essentially the same as the register component. The only difference is that the login component is going to use API/accounts/login as the endpoint for the web API to communicate with. So let's do that. And just to keep it simple, I am going to copy this code. I am going to go to the Solution Explorer. I am going to create a new component, which is going to be called login. And I am going to paste this, and here I will say login, and everything else stays the same. Just that this is going to be login, and here we're going to write login also. And let's say here login user, and let's say here login user. And by the way, just in case, this method name cannot be the same as this component's name. So if you felt tempted to say login method, please know that you are going to get an exception because this member and this component cannot have the same name. So that's why I'm naming it login user. Now after that caveat, let's make our logout component. For that, let's go to the Solution Explorer, New Component, Logout, and let's go back to the Login component and let's change this to Login. And now let's go to the Logout component and say page/logout. Let's just put some text here, login out, and let's use the onInitialized async, override task onInitialized async, and let's use the login service, login service, and the navigation manager in order to say await login service logout, which is going to remove the token from local storage, and it is going to notify the application that we are logging out. Let's say navigation manager, navigate to the root of our application. And let's go back to the login component because when copying and pasting, this got broken. And so let's fix this. And now let's compile the application. And let's go back to Google Chrome. Let's refresh the page. And if we click on logout, we can see that we indeed log out. If we go to people, we can see that we are not getting the list of people. And if we go to login, we can enter our credentials, login, and we can see that we are logged in. And if we go to people, then now we get the list of people from our database. Now we want to be more coherent with what we want to protect in our people controller. Because if we go back to Visual Studio and we go to the people controller, we can see that we have an authorize here on the get method, but we don't have it here on this other get method, nor here on the post method, and so on. So what we're going to do is that we're going to define this authorized at the level of our controller, and now every action from this controller is protected by this authorize. And if we want to allow anonymous users to read this information, we can say allow anonymous, and we can also use this here. So now anonymous users will be able to get, and now anonymous users will be able to reach these two get methods, but they are not going to be able to create a person, nor update it, nor delete it. And now we need to be consistent with this new set of authorizations. We need to go back to our people component. Let's go to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to people. Let's go to index. And we need to hide this new person button if the user is not authorized, because there is no point in showing the user this button if he cannot use it. So let's say AuthorizeView. Let's put this here, and let's say authorized. And now only authorized users will be able to see this button here. And we can do the same. Let's copy this. We can do the same for the edit button and the delete button that we have on the table. We can say this. Now let's say authorize and AuthorizeView. And now again, only authorized users will be able to see this. And now let's go to the other components, to the edit component. And we want to say attribute authorize. In this way, even if the user hard codes this URL, this route in his browser, he will not be able to reach this component. And now let's go to create and also do the same, and that's it. Now if we go back to Google Chrome, if we compile the application, we are going to see that now, because we are authorized, then we can come here, we can create a new person, and we can say create person, and we have that person here. And we have all the options to edit, delete, set person. But if we log out and we go back to people, then we get the list of persons, but we're not getting the new person button here, nor the edit, nor delete buttons here. So as you can see, with Blazor WebAssembly, we can use an authentication system in order to protect certain parts of our application behind a set of functionalities that the framework offers to us. And it is really important that we do not only protect the front end with things like AuthorizeView. We must also make sure that everything is protected at the web API level, because in the end, your Blazor code is going to be in the browser, and so the user is going to be able to manipulate it even if he is not authenticated. But the web API code is different because that is not on his computer and it is not going to be easy for him to override it. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and let me know what you want me to cover next. Thanks.